Japan thought the giants were the disaster. Then my shadows started hunting them on live television. By nightfall, Tokyo felt like the demon castle, and the black heart answered the thing waiting at its center. When I raised my hand, nearly 1,000 shadows moved, but that giant was made to crush armies. AI Anime and Manga presents. If you're enjoying the series, please like, comment, and subscribe. YouTube members get upcoming episodes early and help cover AI narration, subtitles, thumbnails, and rendering. Now, let's return to the helicopter over Japan. The reporter in the helicopter shouted, "Viewers, you won't believe what I am seeing now." Ta-ka-ka-ka-ka-ka-ka. He couldn't help but let out incredulous gasps at the scene unfolding below. The camera panned down to share the sight with the viewers. Several hundred ant magic beasts were marching in an orderly fashion. Leading them was a monstrous ant with wings, Beru. He suddenly looked skyward. Scrash! The reporter clapped his hands over his ears at the shrill roar. The rest of the ants came to a halt. 3 giants stood before them. They looked like a group of mice facing a bunch of elephants, yet Beru charged right at them with claws extended into blades. Scrash! With the army of ants covering every inch of ground in a swarm of black, the ferocious attack ended instantly. "Oh my God, the reporter yelled as the ants started gnawing on the bodies of the giants' corpses. Crunch, crack. On Beru's orders, the ants left enough of the carcasses behind so more shadow soldiers could be created. If anyone got too greedy, Beru didn't hesitate to send them flying with a swift kick. The reporter exclaimed, "They're eating the giants." The insects are eating the giants. The sight of the horrific human-eating giants now being consumed by the ants was cathartic to the Japanese people. There was only one problem. "Oh!" Both the reporter and cameraman shrank back as Beru flew up to the helicopter, grabbed the camera focused on him, and crushed it without hesitation. Snap. Yikes! The reporter and the cameraman clung to each other, trembling. Beru wordlessly looked at each of them in turn, then returned to the ground. The 2 men let out shaky breaths. Despite the winged ants' tendency to destroy 10 million won cameras, they kept following him around because viewers were clamoring for footage of his troops. So the cameraman took out the extra equipment he'd brought along for this very reason, and the reporter, who had grown used to Beru's antics, continued his assignment without missing a beat. After a long beat, the reporter said, "This has been Kitamura reporting live." Eek! A young girl, probably around 12 years old or so, ran for her life, screaming with tears in her eyes. A giant was chasing her with a creepy smile. But how far could she run on her little legs? The distance between them quickly vanished. The giant bared its teeth and laughed as if enjoying this meaningless game of tag. It extended its arm, which looked significantly longer than those of other giants. Just before it could roughly grab the fragile little girl, though, a streak of blue lightning glanced off the giant's wrist, singeing its skin. Zit. Gra. The giant reared up and grabbed its wrist, bellowing in pain. There stood Igris, brandishing a blue sword. He turned to the trembling girl whose legs had given out, face as white as a sheet. Igris picked her up and quickly retreated from the area. The giant spotted the enemy who had attacked it, now running away with its food, and its eyes reddened in outrage. The giant growled. It was enough to make any average person wet themselves in terror. However, someone dared to block the giant's path. It was the elite knight Iron, clad in upgraded armor. He thrust his shield into the ground, puffed up his chest, and let out a mighty cry. Gra! A system notification appeared. Iron is using skill, epic taunt. Another system notification followed. The opponent has entered a state of aggro. The giant that had been aiming for Igris instantly turned toward Iron. The knight pounded his chest a couple of times and then picked up his shield, which was as big as his whole body, issuing a clear challenge. Rah! The furious giant swung at Iron at full strength. Kapow! But Iron didn't budge. Ranking him up had put him on a whole other level. Bam, bam, bam. After withstanding dozens of attacks, Iron let out a bellow. Whew! At his signal, the shadow soldiers and ice bears who had served Jinwoo the longest launched a coordinated pincer attack. Tank, the leader of the ice bear army, shook his head in anticipation of his first battle in a while and roared, "Gra!" It reverberated through the ground for quite a distance. A reporter who had been watching everything with bated breath whooped at the camera. "Viewers, are you seeing this? The minions, Hunter Sung's minions, are attacking the giant." Was this really happening? This particular reporter hadn't trusted Yuri Orlov, so he hadn't expected much from Jinwoo Sung either. But both Jinwoo himself and his minions were currently scattered all over the nation and in the process of purging the giants. Maybe, just maybe, Jinwoo might actually be able to save Japan. The reporter choked up at the thought. "Oh, over there," the cameraman pointed toward the giant. The reporter quickly turned his teary gaze in that direction. He blurted, "How could this be?" The giant was already teetering as lightning from Igris's sword struck it again and again. It was such a beautiful sight that everyone witnessing it was rendered speechless. The Hunters Association of Japan headquarters were located at the center of Tokyo, which could be considered the heart of the country. At least it used to be before the giants had come pouring out of the gate. After his life had been saved by the sacrifices of various hunters and military soldiers during the S-rank gate dungeon break in Shinjuku, President Shigeo Matsumoto had moved the association headquarters to Osaka. While it wasn't the southernmost city, President Matsumoto had decided that all hope would be lost for Japan if they weren't able to defend Osaka and its 2.26 million civilians. It was their last line of defense, their Maginot line, so to speak. Upon hearing that the giants had reached the nearby city of Nagoya, Matsumoto had fallen into despair. Japan was at death's door. Plus, it was futile to plead to the international community for help after the schemes of the Hunters Association of Japan had been brought to light by President Gunhee-go of Korea. Following President Go's press conference, the Japanese government, which had temporarily moved to Kyoto, had urgently summoned President Matsumoto. He knelt before the politicians, demanding he be held accountable. Matsumoto said, "I am responsible for everything. However, someone must also fix the current situation. Please postpone your verdict until then." The Prime Minister stood with his back to Matsumoto. After a long pause, he consented to the terms. President Matsumoto was undoubtedly to blame for this crisis. But like he'd said, somebody had to resolve the dungeon break. His punishment could come later. He could still be made an example of after the fire was put out. When Jinwoo arrived in Japan, an impassioned President Matsumoto was the first to greet him. Though his own fate had been decided, he couldn't let his country suffer a similar one. Goosebumps erupted all over his body as soon as he set eyes on Jinwoo. No way. Jinwoo was strong. Having met so many powerful people during his tenure as president of the association, he could tell immediately. And although he'd been in the presence of countless strong hunters, very few had made the hair on the back of his neck stand up like this. In fact, this was a first. Had he met Jinwoo prior to the Jeju Island raid, he would have cancelled the plan to betray the Korean hunters. Ryuji Goto's assessment of him had been correct. The man before him had a threatening presence. However, his opponents were giant-type magic beasts that had escaped from the S-rank gate. There was no way Jinwoo was strong enough to deal with them on his own. He pleaded, "Please focus on defending Osaka." He needed Jinwoo to buy him some time for the association to negotiate with the United States or Russia. However, the hunter's reply shattered his plans. "No, thank you." Jinwoo rejected the request. President Matsumoto and the other representatives fell into a panic. Had Jinwoo changed his mind after coming all this way? President Matsumoto cautiously asked. Then what are you planning to do?" In lieu of an answer, Jinwoo divided his minions into 3 groups and mobilized them in different directions before heading off on his own course. The sheer number of minions was mind-blowing, but President Matsumoto swallowed hard for another reason. Is he really planning to confront giants by himself? Was Jinwoo going to attempt something all the other hunters in the world had claimed was impossible? President Matsumoto was left with questions but no answer. All he could do was leave the fate of the country to Providence and wait. President Matsumoto returned to the Hunters Association headquarters to assess the current situation. His question was answered sooner than he expected. An employee reported, "The city of Nagoya has been retaken." The president shouted, "What?" and sprang up from his chair. Barely any time had passed, so how could Hunter Sung already have defeated one of the giants? And the reports kept pouring in. Another employee said, "A giant's corpse has been discovered in the city of Nakatsugawa." Another report followed. "The city of Shizuoka has been recovered." Then came another. Takayama and Nagano as well. Jinwoo and his minions were advancing toward Tokyo at an astounding rate. Chills ran up President Matsumoto's spine as the Korean hunter turned the impossible into reality. He could not calm his pounding heart until finally an employee announced, "Kofu. Hunter Sung has arrived in the city of Kofu." President Matsumoto plopped down in his chair at the news that Jinwoo and his minions had reached Kofu, a city a mere 130 kilometers from Tokyo. Employees cried out, "Sir," and President Matsumoto. He couldn't find the strength to stand on his shaking legs. Hunter Sung really had been planning to kill the giants by himself. A thought occurred to him. Hunter Sung is doing what I had planned to do to Korea. President Matsumoto's plan had been to put the Korean hunters out of commission and use the Japanese hunters to take control. But the tables had turned. The Japanese hunters were in disarray, and the Korean hunter Jinwoo was single-handedly dominating Japan. One man was accomplishing what President Matsumoto, the Hunters Association of Japan, their top-rank hunters, and even the Japanese government had jointly failed to pull off. For a long moment, the room was silent. The president snapped out of his daze to relay an order to his worried employees. "Please leave the room. I would like to be by myself for a while." Alone in the empty room, he hung his head. He had never before experienced this feeling of profound loss that now overwhelmed him. President Matsumoto had been utterly, completely defeated. However, his mind settled after some brief reflection and his heart filled with endless gratitude. Quietly, he shed a few tears. That day, my minions and I headed east from Osaka, defeating all the giants we encountered, and finally arrived in Tokyo. Thud, 2 dead giants fell to the ground. The system announced, "You have leveled up." I pumped my fist. I couldn't remember the last time I had leveled up this easily. I clenched my fists. I was heading in a straight line from Osaka to Tokyo, the origin of the dungeon break, and so far, I'd killed 13 giants and leveled up 6 times. Since one giant was equal to a boss of any other dungeon, I received a huge amount of experience points from every kill. Not to mention, my soldiers were busy killing giants as well, which also contributed to my total. I couldn't help but pump my fist with each notification. And speaking of, the system announced, "You have leveled up." There it is. I welcomed the message, which was accompanied by a familiar voice in my head.
"My king, we have dispatched yet another enemy."
It was Beru whose army of ants was advancing the fastest among the 3 divisions. Considering Beru was my strongest soldier and the ants made up most of my minions, that was to be expected. Beru tended to report each takedown. I praised their accomplishments. "Nice. Excellent job."
"Thank you, my king."
I then checked the other 2 divisions through sensory sharing. Although not as good as the ant army led by Beru, the high orc army led by Fang and the elite army led by Igris were proceeding smoothly. I was proud of my soldiers leveling up so rapidly.
Boss, should we set up camp here for the night?
I opened my eyes to see Jinyo pulling out a tent. I looked up and saw that the sun was already setting. I wasn't physically tired thanks to recovery potions and the effects of leveling up, but the mental fatigue was beginning to take a toll. "I need some rest," I nodded. This would be our campsite for tonight. The 2 of us worked together to quickly pitch the tent and prepare dinner. It was autumn and a chilly wind was blowing. As I warmed up the meal provided by the Hunters Association of Japan on the fire, I mused that winter couldn't be too far off. Winter. I could see Tokyo from here. If I described a civilization's rise and fall according to seasons, Tokyo appeared to be in the middle of its winter. For some reason, the devastated city looked familiar. Where have I seen this before? I searched through my memories. The Demon's Castle. Tokyo looked just like the wasted cities within the Demon's Castle dungeon. The only difference was that Tokyo wasn't on fire. My expression grew dark. Could this be? Every single floor of the Demon's Castle had shown cities in ruin. Had the architect of the system been implying something? I snorted. Well, whatever. The architect was already dead in some dungeon. I hadn't had any contact with it since, so there was absolutely no way it had survived. If this was a sign of things to come, I'd just have to stop it. The sole reason I'd amassed power was because I didn't want to be outmatched by anyone. I had leveled up, acquired skills, and leveled up again to finally arrive at this point. Ba-dump. The black heart leaped as if responding to my thoughts. I placed a hand on my chest and smiled faintly as I felt my heart's beat. A doctor at the hospital had told me that there was nothing strange about me, nothing abnormal here. You're perfectly healthy, Hunter Sung. I had gotten a full checkup the night before I left Korea. Although the doctor had scanned my chest twice, he hadn't spotted anything out of the ordinary. The black heart wasn't any kind of physical change. Even though I could feel it beating, it didn't actually exist. That sounds crazy. I laughed in spite of myself. I was relieved to hear that I was anatomically the same as everyone else. But then where was this heartbeat coming from? A gentle breeze blew toward us from downtown Tokyo, carrying an immeasurably scary and almost sticky mana.
Boss.
Jinyo looked uncomfortable. The mana was so powerful, even Jinyo with his low perception had picked up on it. I silently nodded. The wind had obviously originated from the giant guarding the gate in Shinjuku. Compared to the energy exuded by the other giants I had dealt with so far, this felt completely different and sent goosebumps up my arms, but I had to laugh. The black heart pounded in my chest as if in response to the giant's mana. Once I defeated this enemy, how many levels would I advance? And what kind of shadow soldier would it be? I couldn't wait. Igris's elite and Ice Bear armies were the first to arrive in Tokyo, followed by Fang's High Orc army. Igris spotted their approach and greeted them with a nod. Fang grinned under the hood of his robe and nodded in return. Soon after, stomp, stomp, stomp. The sound of marching preceded the large group of shadow soldiers emerging through the light fog. It was Beru's army of ants. They had taken the longest route and killed the most giants, and so were the last to arrive in Tokyo. Igris greeted Beru, who led the ants. Beru, however, walked past Igris and approached me from behind, respectfully dropping down on one knee. Oh, the gang's all here. I tore my gaze from the giant in the distance. You did well, everyone. As I welcomed my shadow soldiers, those who could followed Beru's example and knelt on one knee. The ice bears weren't built to move like that, so they lowered their bodies and touched their noses to the ground. There stood all the humanoid, bear, ant, high orc, naga, and other types of shadow soldiers I had collected until now. They numbered close to 1,000. Everyone, on your feet. The soldiers stood with a gesture of my hand. It was quite an amazing sight. Jinyo was blown away as he took it in. Good thing they're the boss's minions. If they were actual magic beasts. He couldn't help but tremble at the thought of this assemblage of powerful magic beasts loose in the world. He was glad they were his allies, a word befitting Jinyu more than anyone he knew. However, there was an even more awe-inspiring sight behind him. Jinyo swallowed hard as he nervously looked over his shoulder. There stood a giant, the likes of which was completely different from the ones he had seen up to now. The magic beast's head was so far from the ground, it could be mistaken for a skyscraper.
Whoa.
Jinyo couldn't help but gasp. There was a huge difference between seeing it in a video versus in real life. His mouth hung open in shock. I patted the top of Jinyo's head with a laugh. Careful, your jaw's about to fall off.
But boss.
Jinyo snapped out of it and scratched the back of his head in embarrassment. I inspected the giant. How could such a thing exist? It was an impossibly big creature. I felt an urge to flee as quickly as possible because of the terrifying energy emanating from it. I was getting an ominous feeling about this. There were usually two ways to shake this kind of foreboding: run away and hide from the source, or eliminate it. My choice had been made from the moment I'd left Korea. No, from the moment I'd reawakened. Ba-dump, ba-dump. I briefly closed my eyes and enjoyed the sound of my heartbeat, then addressed Jinyo. Stay far.
Roger that.
Jinyo resolutely nodded and hurried away, past the ranks of the shadow soldiers. Okay then. I waited until Jinyo was far enough before summoning the newest members of my family. Come forth. Though not as big as the boss giant, the shadow soldiers that emerged were still hulking figures. I named them No. 1 through 13 in order of extraction. With them comprising the front line, my army seemed all the more infallible. That should do it. My preparations complete, I raised my hand high toward the sky, and the shadow soldiers prepared to attack. My soldiers. My minions were either clad in black armor or covered in black smoke. I looked at each in turn, then faced the giant in the distance. It gazed down at me indifferently, as if disinterested in anyone not within swatting distance. I definitely don't like this. I didn't appreciate being looked down upon. A feral grin spread across my face, and I pointed my hand toward the giant. Advance. Beru flung his head back and screeched.
Scrah!
The army charged forward as one. Rumble. The ground shook with the sound of rolling thunder and dust flew into the air. Finally, my soldiers entered the giant's domain. As soon as they did, the space around them changed. What the? I couldn't help but yell. The giant vanished for a split second, and upon its reappearance, half of my soldiers had been eliminated. Sliding? The giant had slid across the space with his legs outstretched in an incredibly destructive move. He had halved the single mass of soldiers, but they wouldn't let the giant off that easily. The enlarged Fang got right in its face before the dust had settled. Whoop! Fang inhaled deeply and spat out a pillar of fire. Fwoom! This would have melted any magic beasts vulnerable to flame, but the giant managed to block the fiery blast with the palm of his hand. I could feel Fang's shock. The giant grabbed a soldier by the ankle. Ordinarily the size of a building, the minion looked like a child in the giant's grip. It threw the soldier at Fang before he could attack again, sending the two crashing hard into each other. For an instant, I went silent. My eyes narrowed as Fang vanished in a puff of black smoke. The 1,000 versus 1 battle between my army and the giant had officially begun, but it was more aptly described as a one-sided display of violence. The soldiers were getting pummeled by the giant. With each move of its fists, palms, elbows, knees, heels, and feet, it wiped out dozens of soldiers. Bam, bam, bam. The giant moved faster than the most agile hunter ever could.
Scrah.
Upon seeing the giant crushing ants underfoot, Beru started dashing toward it, only for me to stop him. Not yet. Beru took a step back. He and Igris flanked me, awaiting my command, but it was obvious that both were itching to join the fray. It's not time yet. I pursed my lips. Despite the enormous boost from the Black Heart, my mana was rapidly consumed as my soldiers continuously regenerated. However, I stood fast and calmly observed the giant. My plan was to try and figure out my opponent's weakness, using my immortal army as bait. Wham! The giant crushed shadow soldiers under its knee and pounded the ground with its fist. Boom! The streets shook like an earthquake, dissipating countless soldiers into black smoke. With the giant's perfect defense and vicious attacks, the battle was like something straight out of a nightmare. But it wasn't a complete loss. In the middle of the desolate metropolis, my eyes glinted as I concentrated. I knew it. The giant's hard skin was encased by a thin armor-like layer of mana that deflected any damage, so the giant was recklessly attacking without even trying to protect itself. However, there had been one instance where it acted in self-defense. When Fang had used Fire Dragon's Breath, the giant had shielded its face with its hands. What if that wasn't a reflex? Kazel! I summoned the flying dragon. Kazel burst out of my shadow and spread his large wings. Fwop! Kree! I got on Kazel's back. Beru! Igris! Beru extended his own wings, and Igris got on behind me. With both passengers on board, Kazel flapped his wings. Kree! They rose into the air. Let's go! The four of us shot straight toward the giant's head. The giant's eyes shifted to one side. Even though the beast was occupied with battling 1,000 shadow soldiers, it spotted Kazel and Beru heading for it at top speed. I nodded to myself. I was now certain it had the same ability I did to seemingly slow down time. That was how the boss giant was able to move much faster than the others of its kind. The giant began turning toward us. Get out of the way! Igris and I leaped off Kazel's back just as the giant's fist struck. Pow! My eye twitched as Kazel disintegrated. It wasn't fun watching my soldiers being destroyed, but the silver lining was that my target was now within reach. Igris attacked first. He swung the demon monarch's sword downward in midair. Zzz! Blue lightning streaked from the blade toward the giant's forehead. The beast tilted its head back to avoid the blast. Again, the magic beast dodged a second lightning strike to its face. Certain that the giant's weakness was its face, I drew myself toward it using ruler's authority. Beru followed close behind, demon monarch's daggers. I tightly gripped the weapons that appeared in both hands, and Beru extended his claws. Together we launched a joint attack. The ground soldiers finished regenerating and went after the giant's ankles. Kablam! Boom! Flames shot out of the hands of the mage soldiers and exploded on contact with their target. Lightning struck. Pillars of fire scorched, soldiers bit and clawed at its body. Jinwoo intently watched the unbelievable battle unfold, not missing a beat. Jinwoo could only stare, rendered speechless. This was no longer a fight between a hunter and a magic beast. It was a battle of monster versus monster. A magic beast as tall as a skyscraper versus a hunter commanding 1,000 minions. It was hard to decide which was more monstrous. Oh man. Jinwoo felt it was a waste that he was the only one around to witness the clash between these two titans. He tried to calm himself while keeping his attention glued to Jinwoo. Just then, my dagger stabbed the giant in the eye. Shk! The giant reeled, flailing its head in pain. But I wouldn't let go. It's working. I held on tightly to the dagger lodged in the giant's eye and activated a skill. Mutilation. Shk, 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 shk. My other dagger shredded the giant's eyeball. The magic beast's torso writhed violently, but I hung on. I looked over my shoulder as I dangled from the giant's eye. Beru.
As you wish, sire.
On command, Beru flew straight into the opening I had created. With me on the outside and Beru on the inside, the two of us began tearing the giant's face apart. The giant opened its mouth wide in a silent scream. Ants began attacking its immobile feet. Whomp! The giant dropped to its knees as one of the tendons on its ankles was severed. Thud! The ground shook at the sudden dispersion of weight. Despite it all, Beru and I continued our attack. Mutilation. Shh, 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 shh. Mutilation. Shh, 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 shh. Mutilation. Shh, 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 shh. The giant struggled in agony, but to no avail, and eventually it stopped resisting. Its body slowly began tilting to one side until... kaboom! The giant's body crashed to the ground. A familiar electronic chime sounded. Ping! The system announced. You have defeated an enemy. The system announced. You have leveled up. The system announced. You have leveled up. The system announced. You have leveled up. I raised my fist in victory. Yes. I gently landed on the ground and let out a sigh of relief, but then stopped dead in my tracks as I noticed something odd. Huh.